Hi, I'm Milton, Christian Democratic Party. In the early 1970s, as a new Christian, I went to Woolwich Bible College and was appointed the student minister at City Temple in Campbell Street, Surrey Hills. During my time as a student minister, I attended the Sydney ministers' meetings, and we, with the Festival of Light, were seeking permission to have pre-Easter parade through the streets of Sydney, a celebration of Easter to come. But since the Parliament would not agree on our requests, we began discussing how to get pro-Christian political champion into the New South Wales Parliament. It was from this meeting of ministers that a political movement began, and eventually became the Christian Democratic Party. Fred Nile was the third person who was invited to be that political candidate for this movement. Though by this time I had gone overseas and was in Israel, and I would not return until the 1980s. On my return, I was invited by my old political party to run as the Liberal Party candidate for the seat of Swansea. It was approximately 16 years ago I decided to join the Christian Democratic Party, since I had decided to discontinue my association with the Liberal Party due to the Liberal Party's directional move towards a more anti-Christian worldview by more and more of the influential members of the party. I had warmed to the display of Christian content in so many of the discussions I had with so many members of the Christian Democratic Party in those early years. I got on really well with the then state manager, Phil Lamb, and I was disappointed that his employment was terminated, as I considered him to be a good manager, though I was not privy to all things, as I was not on the board, and I could not possibly know all of the details. I noted that the reason for his termination seemed to be that the huge growth in members and his popularity. Some were very jealous of the increased income that he was receiving, as his financial reward was greater than expected due to the agreement to increase his bonuses relating to the increased memberships. There may have been other issues, but I have no direct knowledge of them at all. Why am I telling you this? Because it comes front and centre as I reflect upon my 12 years on the board of the CDP. On one level, I was able to see strong Christian commitments among so many of the membership of the party. And after my first year on the board, I was also able to see that there was a struggle on the board, as some were to pursue a strong Christian platform, and others were really self-centred and worldly in so much of their contributions to discussions during board meetings. It was sad for me to report to you that so many well-respected Christian leaders are often less than Christian when they are in the boardroom. This should never be. I remember saying to many of the members after my first year on the board, I and some other board members will do the best that we can, we'll do all that we can to make the party more Christian and more democratic as we continue to serve on the board as long as we are able to serve there. I have seen many great Christian friends buffeted in such a way that they felt for their own sanity they had to resign from the board, and to some they had to resign from the party as well. I remain close friends with many of these people, and I'm in regular contact with some of them. Every time there was a crisis in the party, Fred Nile spoke of retiring and handing his lucrative job to a selected person. This usually did the trick, and then the problem lost the steam that it had, and it goes out of sight. Members are leaving the party due to the non-management of the problem, and no one seems to really care, as they will be replaced by the new ones who will not know of the problems. And so we continue. This appalled me and others on the board. We were to see special favours to some people, which is appalling and ought not to happen in a Christian organisation. In 2015, the expenditure for the Fred Nile re-election campaign was excessive, and pressure was then placed upon Ian Smith to use funds from an unauthorised account to settle the outstanding bills. This action did have consequences, and so the party is currently on a good behaviour bond by the Electoral Funding Authority. The party is on clear notice to be very careful with all financial matters, or the consequences will fall on all the board members. These consequences can include large fines and incarceration for up to 2 years. During early 2020, certain claims were made on the party's funds, and some of the board members have resisted this attempt to obtain funds that we believe these claimants were not entitled to. As a result of this and other resistance, both Carl Schubert and I were sent suspension notices which were not legal or following any due process. These had to be withdrawn sometime later. Our positions on the board were replaced by yes people. It was at this time that Charles Knox had discovered that a significant number of board members were not financial, and as such were not entitled to be on the board. This problem needed a direct and lawful correction. Charles wanted to get legal advice on the matter, but a cover-up was preferred and no further discussion was permitted on this subject. Then came the 11th of September 2020 and the allegedly unlawful forced eviction of State Director Craig Hall by Anne Wright and company, in company with others, and her allegedly unlawful elevation to the position of acting State Manager on the 14th of September 2020. I cannot explain why the change in title was made for Anne Wright, following this disgraceful email to the membership claiming that Craig Hall had resigned when he had not resigned at all. He has not been paid his legal separation payments even to this day. Such appalling financial and industrial relation breaches by a Christian organisation is beyond belief. The court case trying to right this appalling wrong is extremely long and at snail pace, because those who created this wrong refuse to do that which is right, but rather to continue to do that which is wrong at almost every turn. Some say that Christians should never take Christians to a secular court, and they cite a passage in the Bible to prove this. Well, let's look at the passage. 1 Corinthians 6, verses 1 to 6. It's titled, in my Bible, Do Not Take Believers to Court. Chapter 6, verse 1. Suppose one of you wants to bring a charge against another believer. Should you take it to the ungodly people to be judged? Why not take it to the Lord's people? Or don't you know that the Lord's people will judge the world? Since this is true, aren't you able to judge small cases? Don't you know that we will be judging angels? When we should be able to judge these little things of life even more. So suppose you disagree with one another in matters like this. Who do you ask to decide which of you is right? Do you ask people who live in a way that the church disapproves of? Of course not. I say this to shame you. Is it possible that no one among you is wise enough to judge matters between believers? Instead, one believer goes to court against another, and this happens in front of unbelievers. Note, this passage does not say, never take a believer to court, but actually asks us to take the matter between believers to fellow believers to determine a just outcome. Yet if a person refuses to accept that they are accountable to fellow believers for things that they do wrong, then how can justice prevail within the believers' community? When agreements that are made in the confines of a court can be disregarded so easily by some, how can we expect these people to comply with what is right? Once the process of Matthew 18 verses 15 to 17 exhausted, then what do we do? Let's look at Matthew 18, 15 to 17. Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. But if he will not hear, take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. And if he refuses to hear then, tell it to the church. But if he refuses even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen or a tax collector. An attorney at law says, finally, not all sins are crimes, but all crimes are sins. The church handles sins, but the crimes are handled by the state. Yet both the church and the state are the governing authority that God has provided for us. I do not know where this whole process will end up, but if the decision of the courts is to wind up the party, it is upon the heads of those who have acted selfishly and outside of the law. The real question is, will there be a Christian party that will arise from the ashes so created? The answer is in your hands. That is you, the members of this party. This party that was founded to have such high ideals and yet has never risen to that threshold. You have the capacity to see that from this devastation, that a new vision of a real strong Christian and democratic party that has meaningful policies that are both Christian and democratically developed. Such policies, both Christians and non-Christians alike will find it so easy to support and vote for. I am willing to continue to train anyone who wants to learn from me how I have applied Christian values to all the policies that affect the daily lives of each and every Australian. I do hope that we can retain the Christian Democratic Party intact and then reform it to be honouring to God as it ought to be. Yet we must always consider the alternatives. If and when a door is closed, we must look for another door. At this present time, this door is still ajar, but there is pressure to close it completely. Please pray that God will so direct the Christian community to create a truly Christian and democratic party that will honour our God in each and every parliament of Australia. I want to thank you for listening to me. And I ask you to continue in prayer as this matter comes to its final conclusion, hopefully sometime in the near future. Thank you. God bless.